Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Power Rangers Samurai. So, recently I'm kind of having a confliction about whether to call this like Power Rangers Samurai Season 1 or Power Rangers Samurai Complete Series, because ultimately knowing full well the second season of Power Rangers Samurai is called Power Rangers Super Samurai. And like it's basically said that that is like a quasi different thing than Samurai is, even though it's basically one and the same. Like it's not like they overall completely 100% changed everything about the show. Basically, the only thing that really happens is that there is an extra person that eventually gets interchanged. Going into going into just Samurai, so hopefully people don't get confused of like, hey, when is he going to start talking about this new character that ends up getting added in the second season? No, I'm only talking about like Power Rangers Samurai itself within these first 20 episodes. And then eventually, maybe at some point, if people love me talking about this Samurai series, I'll move on to Super Samurai and this and that. I think at some point, more than likely, I should probably just review just a ton of these series, because ultimately, at some point, there's going to be some people that had a jumping off point or a getting on point with certain number of these series. More than likely, Mighty Morphin Power Rangers has a big following with that, because ultimately people want to hear all the live long about Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, even though at some point, I don't know. So anyways, going into Power Rangers Samurai, there is some good and bad things going on with Power Rangers Samurai, because here is the biggest problem that I think just Power Rangers shows usually have is, instead of making a really good compelling argument to have you invest in every single team member of a Power Rangers show, instead, sometimes they make every single character too bland or all the same, to where ultimately it feels like, okay, like, so I'm not exactly going to be able to easily pick out a favorite, or ultimately I'm just not like I'm just gonna have to like them all because forcibly I have to, because they're all basically one and the same character. There are some kind of annoying things that, of course, have to forcibly be done within a Power Rangers show. So I guess I have to forcibly forgive them for that. But when also looking at it, there's only so many times you can go back to this and repedal it and reuse it, and to like, it's basically, when it comes down to it, it kind of comes down to Peter Parker's like, with great power comes great responsibility. That whole chestnut kind of gets fused into this show, and to where they have to consistently mention something repetitively. Basically, not only do they have to mention it when they morph, but then eventually they have to mention it like, basically just like, hey everybody, get your hands in, hey everybody, hey, now we're fighting, and someone's gonna have to chime in, that ultimately somebody's going at it alone, and they don't like that, so ultimately they're gonna come to them and tell them, it's like, no, like, we should be doing this together forever. And it's just like, that is the big problem I have, is the repetitiveness of like there being this like gimmick thing that they have to throw in there. Like, I guess some people could like it, and ultimately a lot of people will be having like a drinking kind of a drinking kind of thing, of when ultimately people have to have like catchphrases and stuff like that being used in the show eventually when they get much older, because ultimately maybe people still like this show, but yeah, they're just kind of tapering off on the fact that uh that recently this show gets kind of very repetitive through a lot of the seasons. There is a quasi bulk and skull like thing going on in this show, because ultimately you consistently have to use, man, the actors of Bulk and Skull, basically, man, they are just like making like every iteration has them in here somewhere, to the point to where it's like, man, like whoever must have just really loved them, or ultimately they just were like, well, hey, like, do you want to do another season? And then ultimately they were pretty much like, heck yeah, like getting pies to the face yet again for the 800th time. Sure, let's do this again. But in this iteration, we have a lack of one Ash like character, but there's still a Bulk and Skull in the show, because ultimately with the samurais being very bland and kind of very much like there's not a comedic process going on with the samurais, because everything is so like stiff and this and that. We have to break that monotony by having a comedic aspect, which is the newer variation of Bulk and Skull, which ultimately we still have Bulk, but Skull is a little bit different this time around. Um, Ultimately, completely having a generational thing going on here, which ultimately I'll talk more about in spoilers. So, going into this, I would probably say that I like this season, but I probably wouldn't say that I would like this season any more than any of the ones of the shows that I actually did like. It's definitely nowhere near close to being as good as Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, because again, those characters were much more individual and character driven. In Space could maybe be ultimately like quasi close to being as good as this show, but when looking at it, those episodes had much better story. Zio ultimately just had just overall characters that you could have already have invested in, so reasonably it just kind of backpedals and just being like, well, no, like there's a lot of interesting things still going on in Zio. Uh, Dino Thunder and SPD No Way. There's like, so it would probably have to be like, out of all my favorites, it would probably have to be my least favorited, but that doesn't mean that it's a bad show compared to all the awful and or bad ones that were kind of irrelevant. And because ultimately, like, the Power Ranger part of this story is actually really amazing. There's great visuals. The story part is very lacking, or I wouldn't say very lacking, but it's lacking, but it has some good points to it. It really is probably going to be a lot better than a lot of the other shows out there. Even the Beast Morpher one, which I thought was ridiculous to the point of like, I'm not watching this. Like, this looks too goofy. This looks too like they were trying to be a superhero show, and it just like comes off that way. It doesn't come off as a Power Ranger show. It comes off as a superhero show. So Power Ranger Samurai, we have Jaden as Red Ranger. We have Maya as Pink. Mike Green, Kevin Blue, Emily Yellow, and Antonio Gold Samurai Ranger. For those who don't know about the series, there is a Gold Ranger in this, and Antonio is that. Spoilers, but ultimately, if you've never seen a promo package of this show, ultimately you'll know that there is a Gold Ranger coming within this season. And reasonably within this series, I think Antonio overall is just a severely annoying character. I want to apologize to the actor that it's not his fault. It's just the Power Rangers way about going things, where you have to have a character that is a like this character Antonio comes off as heavily gimmicked. Like every single thing about this character has to he has to present like some kind of like flavor to the show, and ultimately he has to be more unique than any of the other characters because he is the technical sixth ranger. But when looking at it, I think I the thing that I hate most about the show is probably that character, not the actor, just that character, because reasonably he is so annoying. where you have where you basically have a lot of the other Power Rangers having no character to them, when you have Antonio who does have character to him, does have individuality, but he is basically the most insufferable part about this show is just when he is on screen saying anything and or being a entity in this show beyond him beating people up and this and that. Like basically this character is probably going to be hands down the worst sixth ranger to me, because honestly, like there is nothing overally like like visually appealing about this character that is ultimately going to be like, yeah, the sixth ranger, this sixth ranger was really cool. Because a lot of times the sixth ranger ultimately is the best looking character out of all of them, or ultimately has some unique like skill that basically makes me go, oh yeah, like if anything, I like all the other rangers, but this sixth ranger though, woo, yeah, yeah, not so much. Like this sixth ranger is annoying, and ultimately he is just not exactly that much of um a thing that I'm going to buy into this show because of the sixth ranger, which ultimately should be always the factor about every Power Ranger show, because ultimately all I can invest in is Jaden. Jaden, the Red Ranger, is probably the best ranger out of everybody. But then on top of that, like he's basically the guy that uh, seemingly is the driving force 100% for the show. Basically, with even a extra sixth ranger, Jaden's like they're very Jaden heavy within the show, which I think is also kind of very off putting to have Jaden such a big presence in the show compared to everyone else. And then Jaden also is the guy that is basically every single time like really the guy that is going to be holding the big weapons, and everybody else is just going to be like, okay, well, here you go. And Jaden has his own story arc within this show. Told me at the very end of this show, we resolve said story arc. So, like, I think I don't know when Power Rangers Samurai was on, when ultimately they started putting out that Power Rangers Lionsgate movie, because I don't know what year that this show came out. But I think more than likely, if this series came out before the Lionsgate movie did, I think they probably took a lot of stuff from this and put it onto this movie, because basically the Red Ranger in the 2017 movie is basically just like this show, where it's like it's too much focus on the Red Ranger, and everybody else is just kind of an afterthought. And then also like Master G is kind of like Zordon in a way, where ultimately like he's getting a lot of time as well to keep like poking in like all the time to either be mentoring people or ultimately to be just kind of consistently. Like I've never seen like I think yeah, Zordon kind of got used a lot, but like I don't think he had gotten heavily used as much as Master G does. And or I could be wrong about this, but it seems like Master G was used in like every single episode. Like you would think that this guy wouldn't have to be in every single episode, but like bizarrely he keeps like coming in and just having like one little like hey good job, and then he ultimately just kind of leaves through some episodes. Like it's so odd that you have this character in here that doesn't exactly add much to, like basically he's just good jobbing people and leaving. Like it's so weird, so weird. So anyways, I think that's all I'm going to talk about this show in a very spoiler like sense. I think that this is a much more viable show than a lot of the other Power Rangers stuff, because when looking at it, all the other shows after once you get to the ones that I've named or which are my favorites, basically everything else just muddles down as it being just shows that go on a hill to die on, because ultimately you don't get cool or unique stuff going on in a number of them. It's just like it's like I'll go into certain special episodes to see ultimately what happens to the characters you've invested in your favorite episodes, but other than that, yeah, just let's go into spoilers. Let's go into spoilers. So at the end of the day, Power Ranger Samurai is probably my least favorite, but at the end of the day, it's still a favorite because ultimately it gets down to those muddled waters of you just hating a lot of the other. Like it's very pulverizing. It's either you like a show or you really hate it. It has to be like RPM has some interesting character development, but I don't care at all about their Power Ranger stuff. So it just kind of gets to the point of just like I hate the show because I should be liking both, but I don't. So it's like it comes down to a very love hate relationship between me and RPM. I've yet to really fully fledgedly like I probably need to watch much more Operation Overdrive to get a real consensus of those characters, but I just feel like all of those characters are all one and the same. They're all severely bland, and that's all I have to say for those those peoples. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time we can do spoil this show. So I'm gonna just chalk pile and compile all of the kind of episodes and then just kind of like reflect on them. So ultimately, if people are expecting for this to be in some kind of numerical order and for me to go through episode 1 all the way to episode 20, I'm not going to do that. I am just not. But I'm going to kind of reflect over 20 episodes and kind of mention how I felt about all of them. So let's go into all these. So, reasonably, we of course have Master Xandred, which ultimately the big main villain is something that I did not care at all about in the show. If anything, there were certain side characters or side villains that I cared much more about. But looking at this show as a whole, like the villain aspect of it, like I did not care at all. Like reasonably, I didn't care about the villains because ultimately they didn't have a good enough backstory. It just seems like the villain just kind of showed up one day. Reasonably, I thought that the whole Deccan story was probably like Deccan should have basically been like the main thing, the main concentrated thing. So basically, Deccan should have actually been the villain of this of this thing, because Master Xandrax was pointless. He was a like what was this character? Why should I care? Because ultimately it's just it should have been Decker, and that should have been like the main bad guy, and Dea should have been right behind him, and then what even was Octoru, I guess the scientist guy that was coming up with all the monster Ash like characters at the end of the day. But anyways, but he wasn't really coming up with them. Like they would just consistently just pop in and just say, "Hey, yeah, I'm the villain for today," because when looking at it, like in Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, you would like have somebody making all the monsters out of clay, which was awesome, and then eventually they would just appear out of nowhere. Or you would just have a lot of interesting like approaches to creating monsters at some point. But again, they start phoning it in to where like the monsters just appear and they're like, "Hey, I'm the villain for today." Or ultimately, they would have some kind of really quasi interesting like approach to getting the villains into every episode. But reasonably, I actually liked Dino Charge's approach to their villain story, and basically, that is probably the best villain story to me, like the concept of it. But yeah, so anyways, going into this, yeah, Decker should have been the main focus. Decker should have been like the basically the Lord Zed if he really wasn't. Like he should have been like the main tier bad guy. Because really the entire story, the entire show cruxed on Decker, and basically that should have been it. So going into this, basically we have it to where Jaden is, of course, the only Power Ranger for the pilot episode. Basically, he is with Master G, and ultimately they are very much realizing that they found some seemingly part of this city where there is this like dimensional doorway to where these monsters are leaking out of and going and attacking people, which I honestly thought was really interesting. And I really wish that they could really do something really good with helping us figure out how um, how villains are getting in and how like it would be fascinating, and I mean fascinating, if we could have villain esh like characters that basically are from maybe some dimension, but they found a way here, and so it kind of becomes like a scavenging hunt or whatever to try to bottleneck these portals or to bottleneck these sections out to where it prevents the villains from coming in. It kind of comes like a scavenger hunt to find out where all these holes are coming from and sealing them up, and you could have had an entire episode about that. To ultimately you have like these like there's so many like it would kind of come out to be much more of like a an investigation like Power Rangers, but um like I think if you had like SPD or something like that, or it was like a police force of Power Rangers, then basically like you could have these like a demon, you can have it to be like a demon investigation like thing where it's like um where you have this like certain section that is only dealing um with very much dealing with very much it being kind of like okay for people that are dealing with the unexplained. That's what the Power Rangers are. That's their department. So going into this, Jaden is ultimately like the probably the key character to invest in. But then eventually, within this first episode, you eventually see them getting other Power Rangers, and then they having their own individual episodes. But reasonably, when looking at those individual episodes, those definitely were nowhere near my like favorites. Basically, the pilot episode is really interesting to me, and then the very next actual interesting episode is probably the wedding episode, where it ends up that the Power Rangers are putting together fake weddings because ultimately it seems that people that there is Dea that is ultimately trying to steal a bunch of wedding brides to collect them all into some uh, bottleneck ash like bottle situation to where every single time these brides cry, it builds up Daya's wedding dress, which I thought was like, man, this episode is actually really smart. It's really brilliant. And I thought that this was the best show or the best episode overwhelmingly was this wedding episode because ultimately it makes the Power Rangers be like these undercover operatives, and it also like is wildly a very different episode. And ultimately, you have a very amazing, um, like story arcing thing to help us invest not only in the Rangers, but to really invest in a villain in this episode because all that we have is just Decker's investment and where he goes about doing and this and that. Bizarrely, we have in this episode Decker is actually the Red Ranger from Wild Force, which ultimately, like, there is no tying to that. It's basically just saying that um he is this very much demon esh like character, and like I don't know what they actually call each one of the. There is some title that they throw on to every single one of these villains. They call them like a demon esh like character of sorts, like some kind of title of sorts. Um, which I kind of thought was like an interesting way to go about doing it because you have to kind of put a title on every single villain. Here's one thing that I do also have a problem. Like, there was one episode where you'd have them showcase that their Power Rangers symbols all had a tie to some element. So basically, you're looking at the Power Rangers in this season, and they are basically the equivalent of Captain Planet. Basically, you have one water, fire, earth, wind, go, planet kind of scenario of us realizing that every single one of these rangers has a element to them, and I thought that was goofy as heck. Um, I thought that that was just weird. That and then ultimately when they have the time which they have to draw their portraits of their symbols, and then their symbols bizarrely turn into like an actual rock that falls out of this portrait, or wind that blows from out of the portrait, or this and that. I again I just thought that there was like I didn't like that at all. I didn't like that we had to really showcase like that these rangers, like, this is where they got their thing from, because I think at some points some of the ranger things they kind of placated to that too, where there were like elemental kind of characters. um I think like in Ninja Storm you had to have like one person had like a water element and one person had a uh like a this kind of element and this and that. And like I think like reasonably, if you're not like, here's a problem that I have with elemental stuff. If you're not going to use it and use it like 100% of the time, or like if you're not going to consistently bring it up, then don't do it at all. That is my plight. That is my problem. That if you're going to bring in like, hey, these things are like elemental like stuff, every single one of these characters have some element to them, it it completely falls. It completely falls. Uh, and plus, I think ultimately elemental stuff only really works if you're also a animal Power Ranger. Like I can understand if like say for example like Wild Force. Wild Force has a shark Power Ranger. You would think then that consistently this guy would consistently be swimming in water like all the time. Like you would think that this guy would just be like super glued to the water, or ultimately you would think that he, when he would consistently fight people, he would always consistently fight people by the water. Like when putties or whatever would come in, you would think that ultimately that that basically we would have it to where he would consistently be throwing like tidal waves of water onto people, because Power Rangers has such a like a substantial computer graphics esh like thing. You would think that they would just like, yeah, I'm gonna have like these water attacks, or ultimately you would think like they would go about that route. But I don't know. It's just probably me. And again, that whole water attack thing could really be a substantial thing that you could kind of add consistently to just showcase a lot. But again, computer graphics is what it is, and probably Power Rangers doesn't want to pay that kind of money. Moving on, the biggest, goofiest thing that I think they pressed way too hard in this show, which one, it's kind of fun, but then again, it's also kind of just like, God, they are using this thing way too much. The Power Rangers have these discs, and man, do they use these discs like all the gosh darn time. Throw it on some throw it on some sword, have the sword spin, and I guess it's like a really cool dynamic. It kind of feels like a fidget spinner to maybe a lot of people, and this and that. But I think that they use these disc things like overwhelmingly way too often. Like you have an entire episode where you have it to where people are fighting for position over the ownership of certain discs. Really? Like, because ultimately certain discs go to certain Zords, and so reasonably Master G is rewarding certain characters for their hard work, but then you also have the Green Ranger that is very much going, well, like, yeah, but I think I'm good enough to ultimately own one of these Zords or and own one of these discs. So I'm going to sabotagingly like take the disc from one of the people because I think I would be better at it. And then ultimately we realize that Master G is ultimately realizing that the main reason why that the Green Ranger is sabotagingly thinking that he is better than everyone, because reasonably like this Green Ranger is better in his own way, and Master G has to figure out how to train him more so differently than everyone else. Which ultimately you never really see that. You never really see Master G like taking anybody under his wing really and going through and just like training somebody. Because if anything, Master G is basically just like showing up to tell people something and then leave. Like he's never fully fledged. Like I don't see Master G training anybody. All I'm seeing is Jaden usually training two people or just training a couple people, and like yeah, it's just like how is it like there's so much about this where it's like, oh well, this person faltered on not training anybody. Well, he wasn't training anyone. there's this whole thing that you're like not seeing on camera of like Master G training anybody, or you ultimately just don't have any kind of real aspect of us seeing how these Rangers are going to get better over time, or this. Basically, you just have an episode showcasing that, like, oh, we're gonna showcase these people in, in this episode to show that they're all of a sudden absurdly really good, and rightfully so, because ultimately you have like the Red and Blue Ranger that are kind of sword fighting, and ultimately a lot of people in the background are saying, "Oh my God, they're really good. They're really good at sword fighting." I'm like, well, yeah, obviously because it's the Red and Blue Ranger. Like, reasonably, if the Blue Ranger just really just was horrible at sword fighting, more than likely he should have been shifted down to Green Ranger, and then Green Ranger should have been shifted to Blue Ranger, because like that's the whole thing that ultimately I did quasi like about SPD. Um, in this instance, that reasonably the thing that didn't make sense to me was in this, for instance, when you would have discs given to certain people told me say that they're working really hard. Why not have them be a much more substantial Power Ranger then? That is my problem, is like, instead of giving people discs, give them like, tell them like, okay, well, you need to exchange your power to someone else, because reasonably, like, you gotta reward people for being a like it's like karate belts. Like, if somebody is better at karate than somebody, then ultimately you need to exchange belts. Like, ultimately it would be interesting to consistently see like a blue female ranger, or uh, a female green ranger, and then ultimately plethora there's a huge amount of just reasonably to where it can be that there's a giant amount of like merchandising possibilities, because you could basically have like five different female characters along with five different male characters, and then also you can have like products or like side toy things interchangeable to ultimately say, okay, well, this is the time that the Green Ranger was the Blue Ranger, and so now we're going to do some unique things with the little side toys to ultimately have you want to buy these products just for the little side things, because this is the time where Jaden bust down and he just wasn't that good and he was a Blue Ranger. But ultimately, there was some stuff that Jaden was still using from his Red Ranger days. So that's what we were doing in here. Uh, so the morphers within this show, like, it was really like, I think the morphers was one thing, whereas I had to kind of get used to the morphers. I thought the morphing thing was just very bizarre looking, because here's this kind of like flip phone ash like thing that ultimately you then had to like you had to just like draw in some symbol and then morph into that. Like, it was something that I really had to get used to, but I think when looking at it, I think this morpher was probably a lot better than, like, this whole morphing thing was way better than a lot of the others in past, because when looking at it, you would just usually have some kind of cell phone, or you would usually have some kind of goofy looking mechanism that, like, the morpher thing kind of looked dumb to me, and I just thought it was just like, God, this is like, morphing thing is just kind of stupid. So Here's my also problem that I have with this show is we consistently have the words being used consistently. With great power comes great responsibility. In this show, we have it to where Rangers together, samurai forever. That, oh my god, is just used to the heavens in this show. And so reasonably, there's consistent portions of time where they have to kind of sift those words in a lot. Um, like we have to fight together forever. And ultimately you have it to where like some of the villains are just like, well, yeah, like forever is a really long time. It's like, really? So yeah, basically you're going to be Power Rangers up until you die, which is kind of hilarious because ultimately, when looking at it, a lot of the characters aren't ending up being samurais forever because ultimately we realize that eventually they go into being other different shows. But I just thought it was kind of hilarious when we'd have like the Power Rangers together, samurai forever, or whatever it ends up being, like samurai together, Power Rangers. It's a lot of saying. I think it's Power Rangers together, samurai forever. Or yeah, I think that's how it goes. Because ultimately the it's together and forever keeps coming up a lot through this season. But anyways, so we have to where the main story is Decker repetitively challenging Jaden for this sword duel. And here's the thing, they have to stretch this thing out for so long that basically this whole swords duel esh like thing takes up the entire season to keep alluding to the point where on the very last episode of the season, then of course they forcibly have to conclude this whole sword duel thing. And like I thought that that was very much interesting, and like to have this long stretch of story, and I assumed that it was never going to get concluded, but it actually did on the very last episode. And so I liked that. I liked like the overall like consistently adding in this sword duel in repetitiously. There were some times where Jaden was extremely tired during doing some other Power Ranger stuff, and then Decker would pop in and say, "Hey, how about that duel now?" And Jaden would say no. Like consistently mentioning that Jaden doesn't want to fight anybody if there's not something really on the line, and so ultimately Decker has to threaten to kill innocents to get Jaden to want to fight him. So that story arc was probably the best thing going on overall in the series as a an ongoing thing that ultimately gets resolved at the end of this. So here's some very much goofy like episodes. So we have an entire episode kind of cruxed on. We have the Blue Ranger having to find some fish, and so because all the other Rangers are all sick, and we have the Blue Ranger. Ultimately, we have Kevin. Yeah, Kevin. We have Kevin within one episode that has to go and use a blue disc on a fishing rod to toss out this certain fish on this fishing or bait on this fishing rod to get some fish to get his rangers much more healthier because they evidently were poisoned. That episode is so stupid. It's so goofy to where ultimately we have the Blue Ranger who meets this like mysterious man that is ultimately trying to like mentor him through this process, and but it's just repetitive. It's so repetitive to just see like uh, this disking fishing rod ish like thing going on to the point to where eventually the Blue Ranger eventually faints and passes out to be rescued by some mysterious man to tell him how to figure this thing out, and for him to want to fish yet again to ultimately solve this whole problem. So also the kind of the sabotaging Green Ranger desperately wanting to have a another shot at getting discs was kind of a bizarre episode that I just thought was kind of stupid. Basically, there are certain episodes that showcase certain kind of Power Rangers, and some episodes, like there's one episode where we find out that I think one of the female Rangers is really bad at cooking. Um, Ultimately showcasing that they were going to have some party, I think, for one of the Rangers, and ultimately one of the girl Rangers was going to cook something, and ultimately the other Power Rangers were like, "Oh, great! Like, not only is this person having a bad day, but then they also have to go and eat this person's bad cooking. Great!" So, kind of a lot of these characters are kind of showcased, but they're not really showcased good enough. Um, so recently, there's like some episodes here and there. We have it to where the other Power Rangers has to have to consistently protect Jaden, which I just found to just be like weirdly throughout a bulk of this season, we have to the Rangers all want to fight together no matter what, and for Jaden to have to pull apart from them and do his own thing to the point where he even leaves the Rangers to go on his own and to just kind of be this guy going on a walkabout for one episode, and for him to eventually come back. Ultimately, yeah, it's frustrating where ultimately you have to force these people to be a team. Like you do have focused Power Ranger episodes, but then you also have to like force them to just go, oh no, Jaden's not going to go and rebelliously be his own character. No, like we have to all come together and all fight as one because that's what Power Rangers do. But towards the end of this season, we have Jaden who is tossing his discs to the Blue Ranger and saying, "Hey, like you need these discs to call for the Zord, so here you go." He's giving the guy the keys to the car, knowing full well that he's like second in command, and so that's what I also liked about this is that like they push all these characters together, but then they also like take one episode to kind of pull them apart. To ultimately, it's just like, hey, you're finally giving someone like a a shot at just going, okay, well, I believe in you that like that. Okay, it's not always going to be that Jaden always has to drive the car. No, he's going to hand it off to somebody else, and somebody else is going to drive the car, kind of thing. And ultimately having the Blue Ranger fight the Zord, ultimately going through a process of like I was like, oh my god, don't tell me the entire time the Blue Ranger is going to desperately think of like, God, we need Jaden here. Where is Jaden? Jaden. Like I'm not as good as Jaden. I'm going to try to figure this out. Like I was thinking that that was going to happen, but no. Luckily enough, like they were just like going, okay, this is where we are, and so now we just have to figure out how to outsmart this villain in this episode, and with one person down. And now let's bring up the Gold Ranger. Like basically, they have to have a whole entire story where ultimately this, because all the other rangers were kind of born into this. Every single samurai ranger had a previous father, mother, brother, somebody that was a ranger before. And I think that is probably the best thing about this show is that they were kind of like a lot of these people were all born into this, and like we have it to where the Blue Ranger was a person that would be swimming a lot, and so ultimately we like I think the Green Ranger started out as being like a very much video game-ish like character, and then ultimately we have like all the other rangers that are eventually come into this fray eventually. So when we have the Gold Ranger and he just shows up, he basically just easily has a tie with Jaden, and ultimately we find out that Antonio had just taken some octopus or some squid-like Zord from Master G and just like has been using it. But also we get it to where the Gold Ranger wasn't exactly born into this. So we have some conflicting things with all the other Rangers and the Sixth Ranger because, of course, like you should actually have that where all of a sudden people have been earning this for so long and then somebody just jumps in and then all of a sudden is just like, well, hey, I'm the Sixth Ranger now. Now I'm the best thing since sliced bread, which ultimately, again, I would love Power Rangers things where people have to earn their spots, but it seems like Antonio is very much just like, well, I come in here because pre backstory. Like basically pushing that like Antonio said when Jaden becomes a Power Ranger that Antonio would come back to be one as well. Where I'm ultimately just like, well, okay, how did Antonio one get his samurai power? And if ultimately it's kind of weird, like was like did Antonio just steal all of like the Power Ranger stuff to become one and has just been hiding, waiting to eventually he'll hear on the news somewhere that Jaden is a like that there's Power Rangers out there now. But yeah, we consistently allude that Jaden's father was previously a Power Ranger, and there is this scene that keeps reappearing that I guess it's the only thing that they could really have showcased when like Jaden has to keep reflecting back on his father and reflecting on the one thing that he said to him before he probably went off and died, I would assume. Um, that Jaden's father had just died in battle. And so like I thought that was just kind of absurd to like you would have thought when they would have backpedaled and had Jaden and Antonio doing this whole backstory thing, you would think the guy that played Jaden's father would be in this flashback, and he's not. We just had the repetitive scene where we're showcasing Jaden's father, but he's not in this flashback episode. So going into this, we have to where Wild Force Red Ranger is Decker, and we really have a really good, interesting story to help us figure out why we should invest in Decker and Dayu, because ultimately we find out that um, Dayu and Decker were actually loved ones, but they can't really show this in their villainish like society because ultimately they would be like shunned or they would ultimately probably be killed or whatever because they can't they can't do what they had previously done in their former lives. They can't but there is some illusion of them and of their backstory and this and that. But so which is ultimately kind of really interesting. So we get like a past dynamic of these monsters before they were who they were. And I thought that I liked that. I really enjoyed that aspect of showcasing that there is more to these villains than we know, and um they have their own like sad song to lead them into being pushed into being villains, and then ultimately tapering back to the fact that they want to finally have their stories resolved, because reasonably, like, we have Decker, who is desperately wanting one last fight, one last challenge, but I'm not really quite sure if Decker wanted to get killed or not. Like, was he just because he's a person that, like, you? I guess you would have to forcibly think like he wants to die. Bizarrely, because I don't think he really wanted to win that match. I think he probably wanted to take on somebody that is overly powered to him to finally rest, because ultimately, if not, then Decker would consistently go to very much killing more people, and basically he's like a vampire where his thirst never ends, his thirst for battle. So yeah, going into this, like, yeah, Decker has probably the most intriguing story, because recently we tie into one of the other villains, and then we've kind of tied to where Dayu and Decker are really starting to have this like hidden kind of relationship going on in this villain esh like thing, and it's ruffling a lot of other people's feathers within the villain's story. So yeah, it's kind of, I like that. I liked that there's some kind of like there's a real true fledgling lead story that's going on with the villains, that it seems to give the villains much more of an in-depth thing. But for a bulk of the time, the villains actually like approach for this one, just like the leader doesn't matter. It's just like the leader of this whole thing doesn't matter. The way in which they go about getting monsters per every episode doesn't matter. It's just like, it's just wait for when you can invest in the villains, or you're just tying your whole entire story on Jaden, and that's about it. So probably going through kind of my assessment of some of this show, but probably not going through every single episode, or just kind of compiling some stuff together and forever. Because yeah, you got to say that all the time. But yeah, so reasonably, this show has really a lot of problems, but then again, it has some pretty decent story. When going into this, the Power Ranger stuff is visually interesting. There's not a Power Rangers moment where I thought that, like, God, these visuals were awful or this and that. If anything, like, the Zord choices were very weird in this episode. There, or in this season, the Zords were weird. The Zords, or the Zords, having them just kind of fully fledgedly being the way of which they were presented in here was just kind of just really odd. Uh, but if anything, I really liked when eventually they compiled all together into a Megazord, and then ultimately you'd have all the people just standing there, just kind of like, I liked how you basically had to do this weird bizarrish dance every single time you would start into your Zord. You would have to like kind of like put this sword weapon into the thing as like a key to ultimately then get you to have it be a joystick for the Zord. I thought that was really interesting. I really liked that aspect of it. I think probably one of the other episodes that kind of stick out to me is the one villain that ultimately would go and smash his hand underground, and then eventually pop up out of nowhere and attack the Power Rangers. I thought that overall, like, that villain episode was really, like, very good. Because ultimately they had to strategize and outsmart the villain. Ultimately, Jaden sacrificed himself for some other ranger to take out the villain of the story, and I thought that was really good. I liked that aspect of it. So yeah, that's what I thought about overall. Like, I'm sure there's a lot of episodes that ultimately people want me to, like, well, what did you think about this episode? What did you think about that episode? But also there's a lot of episodes where, like, kind of they all just kind of seem to muddle through and just be kind of like the same old episodes, because ultimately, like, Power Rangers is kind of like a broken record where it always goes through the same old motions, where you would have most things that just don't quite stick out, or there's some kind of backpedaling where it's mostly just one episode completely focused on a certain ranger, and the story isn't exactly all that good enough. So I don't know. That's probably all that I want to really say about any number of these villains or any of the episodes and stuff like that. Probably the wedding episode is probably the best episode, which is kind of just because it has a really good story. It has a, yeah, it's Power Rangers being undercover, and I wish they could do that a lot more. Basically, have it be like some covert operations or some investigation things going on. It kind of seems that, like, Power Rangers really heavily loses that factor of it being like a, like, why can't the Power Rangers be detectives? Why can't the Power Rangers be like, I think, like in space would kind of be very much kind of like a detective-ish, like, series at some portions, where you'd have, like, Andros kind of stumbling upon him finding, like, the table of villains and stuff like that, like on the very first pilot episode, and him eventually being spotted, and then him eventually being uh, attacked by a bunch of people, to where, like, now it's basically just like, okay, villain pops up, we take him down, and monster grow, and then we kill him. Like, it's like there's nothing of investigation, detective work, undercover ops. There's no police work kind of doing into this. And I know it's like, well, yeah, because this isn't SPD anymore. I get it, but still, there needs to be some kind of, like, story to build to keep people intrigued. And there isn't enough here anymore to give us some kind of uh which is hilarious, because I don't like detective shows, but I think Power Rangers would be better set as a detective kind of show, or an investigation kind of approach, or ultimately being um, some kind of, like, scavenger hunt like episode, or episodes, which ultimately they don't do. Uh, Ultimately, I think it would be better if the Power Rangers would have to find their morphers, or ultimately have their morphers find them, instead of in the end having them just be like, oh yeah, you're going to be the Rangers. Yeah, you're going to be the Rangers for this season. Here's your morpher. Here you go. Like, I kind of wish that it was kind of like a Green Lantern, you are chosen kind of thing, and ultimately the morphers are just very much like going out of their way to ultimately have it be some scavenger hunt where, hey, like, these people are worthy, so they need to go out and find them. And it, like, it kind of needs to be much more like that. It can't just be, hey, here's your morpher, here you go, let's go on to the show. It needs to be more in depth than that. Like, basically, you could have an entire season of just, like, Power Rangers being built up to where every single one of the Rangers has to, like, be an outright, like, you could be interesting. You could have, like, 4 or 5, like, characters that are all trying to desperately be the new Power Ranger, and they're all fighting and jockeying for a position to ultimately get this morpher. And then once they do, here's where you have 2 to 3 other people that are all going to be bitter about this ranger getting this ranger morpher, and so you can then have an entire episode tied to the people that didn't get the Morpher that ultimately are eventually going to be villains in this story, um, because they're bitter about losing. You could have an entire thing about that, but at the end of the day, that's all I want to say. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.